Rachel Parker was a seasoned nurse with 10 years of experience, but nothing had prepared her for the events that transpired during her night shift at St. Augustine's Hospital. The hospital, a massive aging structure, had a reputation for its haunted halls and eerie occurrences. Staff often whispered about strange noises, phantom apparitions, and patients disappearing without a trace. But Rachel had always dismissed these stories as superstitious nonsense. That is, until she experienced it herself. It was a cold, rainy night when Rachel arrived for her shift in the ICU. The hospital's power had been flickering on and off all day, and the backup generators were humming louder than usual. The hallways were dimly lit, casting long, menacing shadows that danced on the walls. As Rachel made her way to the nurses' station, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. "Quiet night, huh?" whispered Janet, her fellow nurse, as Rachel settled in. "Too quiet," Rachel replied, glancing at the empty halls. "Gives me the creeps." The first few hours passed uneventfully, with the usual rounds and routine checks. Around midnight, Rachel noticed that one of the patients, Mr. Thompson, had become agitated. He was a frail, elderly man with a severe respiratory condition, and his eyes darted around the room as if he were seeing something no one else could. "What's wrong, Mr. Thompson?" Rachel asked, approaching his bed. "They're here," he rasped, clutching her hand with surprising strength. "They're coming for us." Rachel tried to calm him, attributing his fear to delirium, but something in his eyes unnerved her. She adjusted his medication and hoped it would help him sleep. As she returned to the nurse's station, the lights flickered again, plunging the corridor into darkness for a few heart-stopping moments. When the lights returned, Rachel saw a figure standing at the end of the hallway. It was a woman in a tattered hospital gown, her hair matted and eyes hollow. Rachel's breath caught in her throat. "Janet, do you see that?" she whispered urgently. But Janet was busy with a patient and didn't look up. Rachel took a cautious step forward, but the woman vanished as suddenly as she had appeared. Shaking off the encounter as a trick of the light, Rachel resumed her duties, though the unease lingered. An hour later, the hospital was eerily silent, except for the steady beeping of monitors. Rachel decided to check on Mr. Thompson again, but when she entered his room, she found his bed empty. The sheets were strewn across the floor, and the window was wide open, rain pouring in. "Janet, call security. Mr. Thompson is missing," Rachel shouted, her heart pounding. Janet rushed to the room, her face pale. "How did he get out? He couldn't even walk." Rachel didn't have an answer. They searched the room, then the hallways, but Mr. Thompson was nowhere to be found. The security footage showed nothing unusual, only a sudden static interference during the time he disappeared. As the night wore on, more patients began to complain of seeing shadowy figures and hearing disembodied whispers. One by one, they became increasingly agitated, and Rachel struggled to maintain order. The fear in their eyes was contagious, and Rachel found herself jumping at every sound, every flicker of light. Around 3 a.m., Rachel heard a faint sobbing coming from one of the storage rooms. She hesitated, dread pooling in her stomach, but she couldn't ignore it. She grabbed a flashlight and headed toward the sound. The sobbing grew louder as she approached, echoing off the sterile walls. Rachel pushed open the door to the storage room and swept the beam of her flashlight across the cluttered space. At first, she saw nothing, but then her light landed on a small, huddled figure in the corner. "Hello?" "Are you okay?" Rachel called out, stepping closer. The figure lifted its head, revealing a young girl with hollow eyes and a gaunt face. Rachel's breath caught in her throat as the girl slowly stood up, her movements jerky and unnatural. "They took him," the girl whispered, her voice barely audible. "They took Mr. Thompson." Who? Who took him?" Rachel asked, her voice trembling. The girl pointed behind Rachel, and a cold chill ran down her spine. She turned slowly, flashlight trembling in her hand. The beam illuminated a row of tall, metal shelves, and there, standing between them, was the woman in the hospital gown. Her eyes were empty voids, and a sinister smile twisted her lips. Rachel backed away, but the woman stepped forward, her movements silent and predatory. The girl in the corner began to scream, a high-pitched wail that reverberated through the room. Rachel turned and ran, the sound of footsteps echoing behind her. She burst out of the storage room and slammed the door shut, her heart racing. Janet was waiting in the hallway, her face ashen. "Rachel, what's happening? The patients are going crazy, and I keep seeing things." "We need to get out of here," Rachel interrupted, grabbing Janet's arm. "Something is very wrong." They made their way back to the nurses' station, but the scene that greeted them was one of chaos. Patients were out of their beds, wandering the halls with vacant stares. Some were crying, others muttering to themselves. The air was thick with an oppressive, malevolent energy. Rachel and Janet tried to restore order, but it was futile. The hospital seemed to have taken on a life of its own, the walls closing in, the lights dimming to a sickly yellow. The temperature dropped, and a dense fog began to seep through the corridors. Suddenly, the power went out completely, plunging the hospital into darkness. Rachel's flashlight flickered, casting erratic shadows on the walls. She heard a low, guttural growl behind her and spun around, but there was nothing there. "Janet, we have to leave now," Rachel shouted, but her voice seemed to be swallowed by the darkness. They stumbled through the halls trying to find an exit, but the hospital had become a labyrinth. Doors led to empty rooms, and hallways twisted in impossible directions. The air grew thick with the smell of decay, and Rachel felt a crushing weight on her chest. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw Mr. Thompson, standing at the end of a corridor, his eyes black pits. He raised a skeletal hand and beckoned her forward. Rachel shook her head, backing away, but Janet seemed transfixed. "Janet, no!" Rachel screamed, grabbing her arm, but Janet pulled free and walked toward Mr. Thompson. As Janet reached him, his face contorted into a grotesque grin, and he opened his mouth wide, an inhuman screech filling the air. The walls around them began to bleed, dark, viscous fluid oozing from the cracks. Janet collapsed to the floor, convulsing, her eyes rolling back in her head. Rachel ran, tears streaming down her face, the sounds of Janet's screams echoing in her ears. She stumbled through the dark, praying for an escape, but the hospital seemed intent on keeping her trapped. The walls closed in, and she found herself back at the storage room door. With no other options, Rachel opened the door and stepped inside. The room was empty, save for the girl, who stood in the center, her eyes now glowing a dull red. "They won't let you leave," the girl whispered. "You're one of us now." Rachel's flashlight flickered and died, plunging the room into darkness. She felt cold hands grasp her arms, pulling her down, and she screamed, but no sound escaped her lips. The last thing she saw was the girl's face, twisted into a demonic grin, before everything went black. When the morning staff arrived at St. Augustine S., They found the ICU deserted. Patients were missing, and the halls were eerily silent. Rachel and Janet were never seen again, their names added to the long list of those who had vanished within the hospital's cursed walls. St. Augustine's closed its doors soon after, but the stories of that night persisted, whispered among the locals as a cautionary tale. Some say the hospital still stands, a dark, malevolent force lingering within its abandoned halls, waiting for its next victims.